Welcome back to the Redacted Culture Cast. I might be your least favorite garage philosopher, but here we are addressing two, maybe not popular arguments, but two arguments presented by one, a well-known philosopher, Žižek, who might have been introduced to the West by Jordan Peterson, and another, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who, although he may not sell himself as a philosopher, occasionally delves in it, and if I were to have a personal opinion on it, I don't think he would deny the title. And we're going to address two arguments, one by each of these individuals that are available on the internet, and we're going to address them and look for some flaws. Now, the reason for this, the motivation behind this, is that the way that we think truly does affect the way that we live our lives. That may sound like a bit of a no-duh statement. However, I want to address the way that these arguments are formed so that we may be better at not only evaluating arguments regarding morality and the source of morality, but also so that we may form better arguments and better ideas ourselves. But before we do that, and before we get much further in, you may notice that the background is different. If you haven't been listening for some time, I am filming from a garage. I am in the state of Minnesota, and Obsidian Arms is also in Minnesota. They are the first sponsor of this channel. And one of the challenges of bringing a product to market or some design that you've been working on is figuring out how to get it made at a reasonable cost at scale. And some of those problems might be turning the idea from a well-drawn sketch into something that is very physical and in front of you, and Obsidian Arms can help with that. They provide a series of services, whether it includes machining and fabrication, particularly of metal devices, or even the design, the 3D development of it. And so if you were to be looking at bringing something to market, something to the firearms industry, something to make our lives better, then I would implore you to give Obsidian Arms a check. You can go over to them at obsidianarms.com. And if you've been listening for a while, I want to reiterate, they make an excellent series of tools that come with a lifetime warranty. And so if you're in the business, the hobby, or the, whatever you want to call it, enthusiasm of building your own equipment and being self-sustaining, I suggest giving them a check to go look at their toolkits. So now let's get into the episode. The first one that I want to address is an argument by Žižek, and he presents a comparison of God to a video game developer. And so I want to let him speak for himself a little bit here.
First thing about video games is that their universe is incomplete. You're in a game, stupid game, where you are shooting, fighting on the main street of a small town, let us say, and in the back you see forest with trees. But it's not part of the game that you can approach those trees and see them in detail. It's part of the game that you cannot go there, so the programmers say, why lose time on that programming? Let's leave it open.
In this conversation, he compares God to a video game developer, that in the world that we live in, the world that we live in now resembles that of a video game in the same way that a video game developer will use, let's say, tricks to convince the player that the world that they're in is much bigger than what they've built. Now, if you're not a video game person, and me being a millennial wonders how many of us are left in that world, because I have certainly enjoyed my fair share of video games, but there is a tool or a trick that video game developers use to provide a feeling of scale, and that is that they will design and develop, let's call it items, images, maybe something like a dome, a skybox is one term, or if you're playing most exemplary in role-playing games like Skyrim or Final Fantasy, if you look past the area which you are capable of traversing, you will see what looks like a world beyond, but if you were to somehow break the game and get beyond those barriers, you'd find that it's barren. There's plenty of humor where players have broken, quote unquote, broken games and fallen through the map, and you realize that what's underneath the ground that you're walking on is not layers of dirt, but just emptiness. And so I don't know what the term for this is, but what we're talking about and what he presents is that in a video game, there is the part of the game that you get to maneuver in, and then there is the part outside of that which is artificial and used to create a sense of scale. Open world, big landscapes, beautiful sky, space, and so forth. Now, what Žižek does in this conversation is he compares quantum mechanics or quantum physics, in a sense, to that concept, as if God were a video game developer and he only designed so much of the world for us to normally maneuver in. That goes down to the atomic level, but if we get to the subatomic level, now we're dealing in an undetermined space. And this is a double argument, one of them against the idea of determinism, which I think is a false foisting of an argument against naturalistic determinism onto a being that he calls God, but it is also a little bit more nefarious. The comparison that God is the comparison of God to a video game developer is itself the first issue. Now, Žižek is a world-renowned philosopher. He has held titles and positions of maybe not authority, but let's use the word high regard before. And he makes an odd mistake here, something that you might expect from an undergraduate, and that is he inserts without official, or he sort of implies a classic argument against God, and that goes something like this. The question asks, can God create an object so big that he can't lift it? Now, this is supposed to be an argument against the omnipotence or the all-powerfulness of God. A classic definition for the existence of God is he is the all-powerful being. And so if God could create an object so big that he couldn't lift it, it would prove that because he can't lift it, he is not God, because he is not all-powerful. And then on the flip side, on the other horn of this dilemma would be that, well, if God couldn't create an object so big that he couldn't lift it, then he's not all-powerful by dint of creation. He cannot create something greater than himself. And the argument, while it may sound witty and at the beginning, is ultimately a failure in definition, because the definition of God is the supremely powerful being. In other words, there is nothing possible that could be greater than him, and so neither the ability to lift a said object nor create an object, or the ability of creation, really has any bearing to do with the definition. The argument is actually a bad argument because it assumes, through sort of subversive insertion, that it is possible that the definition of the thing isn't correct, that which is God is not God because of the framework of the question. But the framework of the question assumes, by the nature of the question, the very existence of this dilemma itself, that God is not God. He is not the all-powerful being. And so this is an attempt, this is a very, we will call it not necessarily a rudimentary argument, but it's an argument that you would not expect from, or that I would not expect from somebody who holds a position of dignity, maybe, or a position, let's use authority, within the realm of philosophy. It's sort of a person who's supposed to be past the doctorate level, engaging in pre-graduate kind of conversations. So the solution to that problem, can God create an object so big that he cannot lift it, is simply, the question is absurd. It is absurd because it requires you to accept the definition as contradictory to itself in order to accept it. You must, by asking the question, reduce God below the definition of God, thus not viewing him as God. And it's not so much a fallacy, but it's just a bad argument. And the reason why I bring this up so early with Žižek is particularly in the introduction of the question, his comparison of God to a video game developer really doesn't fit, because a video game developer uses this strategy of filling empty space with resources less dedicated to visual clarity. He doesn't fill in all the land where you don't travel, because he has a limited amount of resources that he can work with. Your computer, your video game console can only consume or only process so much data, and that data is irrelevant to the player completely and wholeheartedly, and so no resources are spent on creating material irrelevant to the player. But God is not a video game developer. God is not limited in his ability, by definition, to creation. So the first error, the first challenge, is the false comparison of God to a video game developer, imposing the limitations of the video game developer onto that of God.
Quantum physics does it not have the same lesson? When God was programming the universe, he said people are too stupid to reach beyond the atom. So why should I bother their programming? He left it undetermined. And we were a little bit too bright for God, and we, as you say in English, caught God with his pants down, as it were.
So maybe it's a bad comparison. But then you say, so what if it's true? The argument asserts then that God didn't intend for mankind to extend our exploration of the world beyond that of the atomic level, because as far as we can sort of manage in our current state in scientific and philosophical affairs, we see that at least down to the atomic level, most of the world that we live in is predictable in some sense. It is at least regular. Whereas quantum physics and quantum mechanics gets into the realm of non-predictability. And so the argument asserts that God didn't intend or expect mankind to be able to observe the creation or the world itself, the physical world, on a non-predictive level. And this is a very classic error, but it's one well encapsulated in this argument, because again, it's implying or asserting specific ideas. One, it is implying or asserting that quantum mechanics is truly non-predictive. It asserts that because the person observing it cannot predict it, then it must be unpredictable, and we'll get back to that in a moment. So, the first question is, and the first challenge with Žižek is, why are you ascribing intent? Ascribing intent as a philosopher should be one of a cardinal sin. As in, I am not trying to ascribe, to place intent on a person, but determine it. I'm trying to understand what a person or being's intent might be. And the failure, the critical failure of ascribing intent is again another example of bad philosophy. He assumes that because we perceive that quantum mechanics is non-predictable, that God intended it to be non-predictable, and it also is, in truth, non-predictable in the universe. And it does not allow the option, he just blows past the option, that perhaps it is a predicted environment or it is a determined environment, but we are not capable of observing the scale of determinism. Now, determinism can be a dirty word in some circles, and it can be an ethically challenging term in the realm of morality, but on the level of metaphysics and what is reality itself, then we are having to ask the question, why is the world thus regular? Why is it that gravity accelerates at a constant rate? Why is it that salt boils in water? And the issue of ascribing intent is itself perhaps more along the lines of an ad hominem. It's not only a bad argument, it's also in bad taste. But the second one goes a layer deeper, and it has to do with what you see in a lot of postmodern thought. And postmodernism has been the whipping boy of certain political circles and certain philosophical realms for a while, but it's important to understand where postmodernism goes wrong. And this is a great place of illustrating it. Žižek assumes, through implication, so far as I can understand in this argument, that the quantum level is unpredictable because mankind cannot predict it. And this is in a more simplified phrase, the idea that if I can't understand something, it is unintelligible. And in the realm of morality, especially in hard, difficult moral situations, you see more or less attempts to escape the burden of understanding what is true by reducing it all to perspective. Now, it might be a bit of a generalization, but one key feature or core tenet of Enlightenment philosophy was that the world was objectively intelligible, as in, if we applied the process of rationality or rationalism, as well as what became the scientific method, long enough and thorough enough, we could understand the world, if not at an objective level, a near objective level. And while there may be some criticism against how general this belief was held, it tends to be used as a definition for Enlightenment philosophy, a heavy, heavy reliance on rationalism. But after World War I and many events that happened around that, as well as a change in Western philosophy, one of them notably with Nietzsche, who likes to people like to quote him, the challenge of objectivity a challenge was brought against objectivity itself. And this is where we get moral relativism. And the argument can be somewhat loosely framed as, because we cannot observe the world objectively, that each of us observes the world through our subjective lens, then there must not be an objective truth. And in cases of morality, this might be more palatable, but in cases of physics and metaphysics, it certainly isn't. But here comes the issue, and here comes the way that it's presented. It applies a sense of not necessarily humility, but arrogance to the field of epistemology. And it asserts that because I can't know it, it can't be known. And in the argument by Žižek here, with the unpredictability of quantum level physics, then if I can't predict it, then it must not be predictable. And so the world that we live in this metaphor of a video game containing non-predicted elements, which would be that space outside of the playable area, let's call the playable area everything down to the atomic level, because we perceive it to be unpredictable out there, it must be unpredictable, which is then used as a dagger against the omnipotence and the omniscience of God. So if we can't determine things on the quantum level, then they must be undetermined, and if they are undetermined, then God cannot be real, or at least whatever it is that we are calling God cannot be all-knowing. But you see the same failure in the argument, the same weakness in the argument, is that it relies on one assuming that the person who is making the assumption or the assertion to somehow have authority of what is knowledgeable at all. And so Žižek, in this argument, in this comparison of God to a video game developer, not only makes a failure of comparison on the introductory level by comparing the omnipotence of God to the limitations of a video game developer, he then also applies a sense of intent as if God was pulling one over on mankind. And then third, goes so far as to assert the postmodern issue that if it can't be determined by me, then it must not be determinable. And this is most egregious on moral grounds by assuming that if I cannot figure out what is right and what is wrong, or if I cannot figure out in a dispute where the right and wrong was done, then there must not be right and wrong. If I cannot see a clear black and white, then everything must be shades of gray. It is projecting our subjectivity onto the world instead of understanding that there is a difference between the objectivity outside of our mind and the subjectivity from our perspective. And Žižek, I think he deserves a sense of, maybe not credit, but he deserves a level of pushback, but then also recognition because he has been in the field for some time, and that is just simply an argument from authority, but I don't want to encourage a world where we just throw rocks at giants in that case. Now, to those who are not watching on YouTube, the scenery has changed a little bit here. But before you skip ahead, this part is not an ad. This is a revision of the second half of this episode. Now, I want to let you in on a little secret, and it's not really a secret, but bear with me. Arguments, particularly intellectual arguments, oftentimes have the utility of trying to produce the conclusion or convince somebody of the conclusion, particularly in rhetoric. This may sound like it's a very complicated way to explain something very simple, but if we look at how arguments are used in what we think or we want to be ideal intellectual conversation, we think of them as tools for getting a certain point across, or for arguing for truth, or to try to understand something. Now, the face value of many arguments is simply what they are. An argument exists, or the utility of an argument is to convince or to convey an idea. But there are also arguments that have perhaps a hidden utility in them as well, and they serve, in a sense, as a trap or a rubric. And in this video that I'm about to play a segment of, Neil deGrasse Tyson uses an argument that has a utility beyond the argument itself. So let's listen here to Neil deGrasse Tyson talking about the problem of evil.
The more I look at the universe, just the less convinced I am that there is something benevolent going on. So if your concept of a creator is someone who's all powerful and all good, that's not an uncommon pairing of powers that you might ascribe to a creator. All powerful and all good. And I look at disasters that afflict Earth and life on Earth. Volcanoes, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, disease, pestilence, congenital birth defects. You look at this list of ways that life is made miserable on Earth by natural causes. And I just ask, how do you deal with that? So philosophers rose up and said, if there is a God, God is either not all powerful or not all good. I have no problems if, as we probe the origins of things, we bump up into the bearded man.
So, in summary, the problem of evil typically goes something like this. If God is all-powerful and all-knowing and all-good, how can there be evil in a world that he created? If the evil got into his world without his knowledge or outside of his ability, then he is not all-powerful or he is not all-knowing. If evil somehow slipped into this world absent his knowledge, then he can't possibly be all-knowing. Or if it got in, it forced its way in, apart from his strength or his creative power, then he can't be all-powerful. Or perhaps most deviously is that if God created a world where evil exists and he did so knowingly, then he cannot be all good. And this intellectual problem is, here's the secret, here's the trap of it. The problem of evil is a useful argument for identifying pseudo-intellectuals. And so the problem of evil isn't really an argument itself that stands on many grounds, but rather the utility that it can be used for is identifying how much a person thinks, how smart a person thinks they are. Now, pseudo-intellectualism tends to be a slur or it's a dig, something that's thrown at people, but it's also something to be warned of and be careful of in case you find yourself following somebody who works very hard to appear smart, but turns out not to be. And I'll use the metaphor of a National Guardsman here in a minute to bring this out. So, the problem of evil is an argument against the existence of God on the evidence that evil exists. And while we certainly can identify evil in the world. We have this thing called a conscience. The problem of evil is a failure on the level of analysis because it asserts through some force that the person making the argument is capable of evaluating right and wrong, good and evil, as if they were God themselves. So if we were to think of mankind as characters in a video game and God as the creator of the video game, how would the creator of the video game respond if the product that he created, the people, the beings that he created in the video game, turned around and started criticizing him for not doing something to their liking? Well, first of all, it would be absurd, but second of all, and more importantly, the only way that the creation could do that, could attempt to criticize God, would be if he wrote some part of that into their code. That's maybe like a generative AI concept, is that it would be something that the creator produced, namely intellect. But the creation, the character in the video game, or in our sense, ourselves, if we are engaging in the problem of evil, we have to recognize that the problem of evil's fundamental failure is that it asserts without evidence that the person making the claim has omniscience themselves. And so in this argument by Neil deGrasse Tyson, he might present himself as if he's making an argument against the existence of God, but it turns out Neil deGrasse Tyson, as well as those who are easily convinced by the problem of evil, do believe in God. The problem is they believe that it is themselves who have that omniscient, godlike observation. So if the problem of evil were simply a kind of trick of words, we would look at, well, the premises. What are the premises? Well, the premises are, is God all-powerful and all-knowing and all good, and yet evil exists? So these two things are a contradiction. Wrong. Wrong. They are not a contradiction so long as we recognize that the thing that created good, that is the source of goodness himself, is also the thing by which we understand evil. Anything that is in opposition or a diminishment of the perfect good is, by our definition, evil. Now, I am not original in this idea, and the problem of evil is not really an original question, no matter how witless people tend to bring it up over and over and over again. And you might not be surprised that when you see the kind of type, it sounds a little stereotypical, but the type of person who's easily convinced by the problem of evil tends also to be a narcissist or have narcissistic tendencies. Because the problem with the problem of evil is the arrogance of the person arguing it. Now you might say, hey, isn't that an ad hominem? Yeah, kind of. Let's even give it a maybe. Because while I am describing the character of the person making the argument instead of defending the argument, what I am also arguing is that the argument is dependent on the person making the argument also being omniscient, which we know not to be true. So it itself can only exist if we accept a premise that we would never accept in the real world. We would never accept that a person, a human being, is omniscient unless we had some ulterior motive. You might even go so far as to say that the argument of the problem of evil is itself an ad hominem, but through implication. And it implies that the person speaking has some sort of divinity to them, which requires affirmation. Now, what is a metaphor for this? Let's just say we are in a 2020 scenario again. We're back in 2020, the world is on fire, riots in the streets, and you and a couple of random people that you've been connected with in your metaphorical end-of-the-world scenario have set up sort of an emergency network to look out after your neighborhood. And let's say you've got a guy who was, or maybe still is, in the National Guard but has not been activated. Now, if that person who was in the National Guard now, and who has maybe a deployment that was a non-combat deployment, administrative deployment to somewhere where there was no violence, it was not a wartime experience. And let's just assume that he doesn't have any actual experience with riots and violence, but he asserts authority as if he were a Delta Force operator or something of that sort. That is the problem. The problem is not that he is in the National Guard. It's that he is trying to assert himself as being something he is not, namely a Delta Force operator. And so within our culture, within our milieu, the challenge so much isn't that people, not only do we base our identities on our jobs, which is something that I've done and we might want to do less of, but the issue that we run into with sort of the National Guard problem is not so much that a person is in the National Guard. The thing that we find distasteful is when he asserts authority that is undeserved, namely being a Special Forces guy or a cool guy or a Navy SEAL or whatever. Instead, if you were just to say, hey, I was in the National Guard, this is what I know, then he would be an asset to the group. But if he is a liar and it's about his identity, that he has to be the coolest guy, he has to be the Delta Force guy, then we have a problem. And so we see this reflected in various parts of our culture, in various parts of the country, in various parts of society, and it's oftentimes distasteful. And the problem of evil is the intellectual equivalent of asserting oneself as something they are not. We are not omniscient. We are not God. If we were to, say, make moral evaluations of the author of morality itself, that would be an act of not only rebellion, but out of absurdity, because it is not possible that we, who are only given the tools to make evaluative decisions, it would be absurd for us to take the tools from the thing that granted us and then bite, metaphorically, the hand that feeds us by claiming, thank you for the tools of evaluation, now I'm going to evaluate you as wanting. It would be a mistake on the level of analysis. And so when we understand and when we engage in ideas, particularly those that have to do with identity, morality, the use of force, and the idea of rights to begin with, we set ourselves up for failure when we hold premises, even through implication, to be true, that are not true. We are not gods. We are men. And so, if you are out in the world and you encounter somebody boisterously proclaiming the problem of evil as if it was a witty remark, be warned, for you are dealing with a pseudo-intellectual, somebody who thinks they're smart, but really aren't. So, if this has been helpful or has been entertaining, I know I'm getting shadow banned pretty hard across the internet, especially on platforms like Instagram. But if you would, leave a comment down below, go and share this with your friends, share this with your community, because I think these are the arguments that I'm bringing to our community and to you that hopefully will make your life better. And if you want to know how that works with a pseudo-intellectual, consider a pseudo-intellectual somebody who is wielding a chainsaw and swinging it around without knowing what he's doing. It's dangerous, even if it's not always malicious. That being the case, this has been the Redacted Culture Cast. You can support us at redactedllc.com or redactedculture.locals.com. And if you would, leave your best example of a pseudo-intellectual in the comments below. We'll talk to you soon. Now go forth and conquer.